Welcome to today's exploration of one of history's most chilling questions. How did a failed artist from Austria transform an entire nation of educated, cultured people into willing participants in genocide? Picture this scene. Berlin, May 1st, 1933. Hundreds of thousands of Germans packed the streets, their arms raised in salute, their voices thundering in unison as they cheer for a man who would lead them into the darkest chapter of human history. These aren't mindless zombies or inherently evil people. These are teachers, doctors, engineers, mothers, fathers, ordinary citizens of what was once Europe's most advanced democracy. How did it happen? How did Hitler and his Nazi party accomplish what seems impossible? The systematic brainwashing of an entire nation. The answer isn't simple, and it's not comfortable. It reveals uncomfortable truths about human psychology, the fragility of democracy, and the terrifying power of sophisticated propaganda. Over the next hour, we'll journey through the twisted machinery of Nazi mind control, from the beer halls of Munich to the concentration camps of Eastern Europe. We'll uncover the techniques, the timeline, and the tragic effectiveness of history's most comprehensive campaign of mass manipulation. This isn't just a story about the past. As we face our own era of information warfare and political polarization, understanding how Hitler brainwashed Germany becomes more than historical curiosity. It becomes essential knowledge for protecting our own democracy. Chapter 1. The Wounded Nation. The story of Nazi brainwashing begins not with Hitler's rise, but with Germany's fall. November 11, 1918. In a railway car in the French forest of Compiègne, German representatives signed the armistice ending World War I. For 4 years, the German people have sacrificed everything for victory. Now, suddenly, inexplicably, their leaders tell them they have lost. The psychological impact is devastating. German soldiers return home to a country they no longer recognize. The Kaiser has fled. Revolution erupts in the streets, and foreign armies occupy German soil. Worse still, the Treaty of Versailles soon strips Germany of territory, military, and dignity. The nation that once dominated Europe now faces crushing reparations and international humiliation. Into this vacuum of confusion and rage steps a powerful narrative, the stab-in-the-back myth. Germany didn't lose on the battlefield. This story claims it was betrayed by internal enemies. Jews, communists, and democratic politicians supposedly sold out the brave German soldiers who were on the verge of victory. This lie becomes the foundation stone of Nazi propaganda because it offers what every traumatized nation craves: someone to blame. The Weimar Republic, Germany's first democracy, struggles to govern a nation that has never known democratic tradition. Economic chaos follows political instability. Hyperinflation in 1923 destroys the savings of the middle class overnight. A loaf of bread costs billions of marks. Families burn money to stay warm because it's cheaper than buying firewood. The very concept of stable value in currency, in government, in truth itself collapses. This economic and political chaos creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance on a national scale. The German people's existing beliefs about their nation's greatness clash violently with their humiliating reality. When humans face such psychological stress, they become desperate for simple explanations and strong leaders who promise to restore order. They become, in essence, primed for manipulation. Hitler understands this vulnerability instinctively. In beer halls and meeting rooms across Bavaria, he begins crafting a message that directly addresses Germany's psychological wounds. He doesn't offer complex policy solutions. He offers emotional satisfaction. He tells Germans they are victims, not failures. He promises revenge against their betrayers. He vows to restore their lost greatness. The wounded nation becomes fertile ground for the seeds of fascist manipulation. Every subsequent technique Hitler employs, from propaganda to violence to institutional control, builds upon this fundamental psychological foundation. A traumatized people as desperate need to believe in their own victimhood and superiority simultaneously. This sets the stage for one of history's most systematic campaigns of mass psychological manipulation, beginning with Hitler's first attempts to capture the German imagination. Chapter 3. The Propaganda Machine. Berlin, 1933. Joseph Goebbels stands before his newly created Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, arguably the most sophisticated mind control apparatus in human history. Under his direction, Nazi propaganda becomes far more than simple political messaging. It becomes a total system for reshaping reality itself. Goebbels understands a fundamental principle that modern marketing experts would later rediscover. Repetition creates truth in the human mind. He floods Germany with Nazi messages through every possible channel. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, films, posters, rallies, and even children's books all carry the same themes. Germans cannot escape the Nazi worldview because it surrounds them completely. The content of this propaganda follows carefully crafted psychological principles. Nazi messages are kept simple and emotionally powerful. Complex policy debates are reduced to stark moral choices between good and evil, strength and weakness, purity and corruption. "The Jew is our misfortune" becomes a slogan repeated millions of times until it feels like common sense rather than murderous prejudice. Visual propaganda proves especially powerful. Nazi designers create symbols, colors, and imagery that trigger deep psychological responses. The swastika, an ancient symbol of good fortune, is transformed into an emblem of power and destiny. Red evokes blood, sacrifice, and revolution. Black suggests strength and authority. These visual elements appear everywhere, creating a landscape that constantly reinforces Nazi ideology. The Nazis also pioneered the use of mass media for political control. Radio becomes their primary weapon, broadcasting directly into German homes. Hitler's speeches reach millions simultaneously, creating the illusion of personal connection with the leader. Families gather around their radios for major Nazi broadcasts, turning propaganda consumption into a shared social ritual. Cinema receives special attention as a propaganda tool. Goebbels personally oversees the production of films that blend entertainment with indoctrination. Movies like Triumph of the Will present Nazism as aesthetically beautiful and historically inevitable. Other films demonize Jews through carefully crafted stereotypes, making anti-Semitism seem natural and justified. Perhaps most insidiously, Nazi propaganda infiltrates education. Textbooks are rewritten to reflect Nazi racial theory and historical interpretation. Children learn that their highest duty is service to the state and submission to the Führer. Mathematics problems involve calculating the cost of caring for disabled people. Geography lessons emphasize Germany's need for living space in Eastern Europe. The propaganda machine also employs sophisticated psychological techniques to break down individual resistance. Constant rallies and public demonstrations create a sense of overwhelming popular support for Nazi policies. Germans who might privately doubt the party line see massive crowds cheering Hitler and conclude they must be wrong to dissent. Social pressure becomes a tool of manipulation. The Nazis create an atmosphere where expressing support for the regime brings rewards: better jobs, social acceptance, protection from persecution. Opposition, meanwhile, carries severe costs. This creates a spiral of public conformity that makes resistance seem impossible and foolish. The regime also controls information flow carefully, censoring opposing viewpoints while amplifying supportive messages. Germans receive a steady diet of Nazi successes and foreign threats while remaining largely ignorant of the regime's failures and atrocities. This information control doesn't require perfect censorship. It only needs to make alternative viewpoints seem rare and unreliable. Through this comprehensive propaganda system, the Nazis begin reshaping German consciousness itself. They don't simply convince Germans to support specific policies. They alter how Germans perceive reality, truth, and morality. Chapter 3. The Propaganda Machine. Berlin, 1933. Joseph Goebbels stands before his newly created Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, arguably the most sophisticated mind control apparatus in human history. Under his direction, Nazi propaganda becomes far more than simple political messaging. It becomes a total system for reshaping reality itself. Goebbels understands a fundamental principle that modern marketing experts would later rediscover. Repetition creates truth in the human mind. He floods Germany with Nazi messages through every possible channel. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, films, posters, rallies, and even children's books all carry the same themes. Germans cannot escape the Nazi worldview because it surrounds them completely. The content of this propaganda follows carefully crafted psychological principles. Nazi messages are kept simple and emotionally powerful. Complex policy debates are reduced to stark moral choices between good and evil, strength and weakness, purity and corruption. "The Jew is our misfortune" becomes a slogan repeated millions of times until it feels like common sense rather than murderous prejudice. Visual propaganda proves especially powerful. Nazi designers create symbols, colors, and imagery that trigger deep psychological responses. The swastika, an ancient symbol of good fortune, is transformed into an emblem of power and destiny. Red evokes blood, sacrifice, and revolution. Black suggests strength and authority. These visual elements appear everywhere, creating a landscape that constantly reinforces Nazi ideology. The Nazis also pioneered the use of mass media for political control. Radio becomes their primary weapon, broadcasting directly into German homes. Hitler's speeches reach millions simultaneously, creating the illusion of personal connection with the leader. Families gather around their radios for major Nazi broadcasts, turning propaganda consumption into a shared social ritual. Cinema receives special attention as a propaganda tool. Goebbels personally oversees the production of films that blend entertainment with indoctrination. Movies like Triumph of the Will present Nazism as aesthetically beautiful and historically inevitable. Other films demonize Jews through carefully crafted stereotypes, making anti-Semitism seem natural and justified. Perhaps most insidiously, Nazi propaganda infiltrates education. Textbooks are rewritten to reflect Nazi racial theory and historical interpretation. Children learn that their highest duty is service to the state and submission to the Führer. Mathematics problems involve calculating the cost of caring for disabled people. Geography lessons emphasize Germany's need for living space in Eastern Europe. The propaganda machine also employs sophisticated psychological techniques to break down individual resistance. Constant rallies and public demonstrations create a sense of overwhelming popular support for Nazi policies. Germans who might privately doubt the party line see massive crowds cheering Hitler and conclude they must be wrong to dissent. Social pressure becomes a tool of manipulation. The Nazis create an atmosphere where expressing support for the regime brings rewards, better jobs, social acceptance, protection from persecution. Opposition, meanwhile, carries severe costs. This creates a spiral of public conformity that makes resistance seem impossible and foolish. The regime also controls information flow carefully, censoring opposing viewpoints while amplifying supportive messages. Germans receive a steady diet of Nazi successes and foreign threats while remaining largely ignorant of the regime's failures and atrocities. This information control doesn't require perfect censorship. It only needs to make alternative viewpoints seem rare and unreliable. Through this comprehensive propaganda system, the Nazis begin reshaping German consciousness itself. They don't simply convince Germans to support specific policies. They alter how Germans perceive reality, truth, and morality. Chapter 4. Creating the Enemy Within Nuremberg. September 1935. Before hundreds of thousands of cheering Germans, Hitler announces the laws that will strip Jews of citizenship and civil rights. But this moment represents more than legal discrimination. It marks the culmination of a carefully orchestrated campaign to create what every totalitarian regime requires: a designated enemy within. The psychological function of this internal enemy cannot be overstated. Humans naturally organize their thinking around us versus them categories, a survival mechanism from our tribal past. Hitler exploits this tendency by creating a clearly defined them that explains all of Germany as problems and justifies any extreme measures in response. Jews become the perfect scapegoat for Nazi manipulation because they fulfill multiple psychological needs simultaneously. They are visible enough to identify, but small enough to attack without serious resistance. They have been subjected to centuries of Christian anti-Semitism, making prejudice against them seem traditional rather than revolutionary. Most importantly, they can be blamed for contradictory problems: both capitalism and communism, both cosmopolitan modernism and traditional conservatism. The Nazi campaign against Jews follows a predictable pattern that would later be replicated by other genocidal regimes. First comes dehumanization. Jews are portrayed as fundamentally different from and inferior to real Germans. Nazi propaganda depicts them as rats, parasites, and bacteria infecting the healthy German body. This language makes violence against Jews seem like necessary hygiene rather than murder. Next comes systematic isolation. Jews are banned from parks, theaters, universities, and eventually from most public spaces. They must wear identifying yellow stars, making them visible targets for harassment. Their businesses are boycotted and destroyed. Their children are expelled from schools. This isolation serves dual purposes. It weakens Jewish resistance while making their suffering invisible to Germans who might otherwise object. The legal framework steadily escalates persecution. The Nuremberg laws prohibit marriages between Jews and non-Jews, defining racial categories with pseudo-scientific precision. Later laws confiscate Jewish property, eliminate Jewish businesses, and force Jews into segregated ghettos. Each step seems logical given the previous step, creating a gradual escalation that never shocks Germans into resistance. Perhaps most insidiously, the Nazis make ordinary Germans complicit in Jewish persecution. Non-Jews benefit from confiscated Jewish property, take over Jewish businesses, and move into abandoned Jewish homes. This creates psychological investment in anti-Semitic policies. To oppose persecution would mean admitting participation in injustice and potentially losing material benefits. The regime also uses Jewish persecution to test and strengthen German loyalty. Defending Jews becomes a form of disloyalty to Germany itself. Germans who express sympathy for Jewish neighbors face social ostracism and potential legal consequences. This makes silent complicity seem like the only reasonable option for most people. Violence against Jews serves as both practical intimidation and psychological conditioning. The November 1938 Kristallnacht attacks on Jewish businesses and synagogues demonstrate the regime's power while testing public tolerance for extreme measures. When Germans failed to protest these outrages, the Nazis gained confidence to escalate further. The creation of an internal enemy also provides a unifying purpose for German society. Fighting Jews becomes a patriotic duty that transcends class, regional, and political differences among Germans. Teachers, police officers, bureaucrats, and ordinary citizens all find roles in the anti-Semitic project, creating a shared sense of mission and identity. This enemy creation process reveals a crucial truth about Nazi manipulation. It doesn't simply exploit existing prejudices, but systematically cultivates and intensifies them. Germans in 1933 were not uniformly anti-Semitic, but by 1941, Most had been conditioned to accept Jewish extermination as necessary, or at least tolerable. The success of this campaign provides the psychological foundation for the Holocaust while demonstrating how quickly civilized people can be manipulated into accepting the unthinkable. Chapter 5. The Youth Indoctrination Program. A 10-year-old boy stands in a Munich classroom, his hand raised in the Nazi salute as he recites his morning pledge. "I promise to do my duty at all times in love and faithfulness to the Führer." This scene, repeated in thousands of German schools, represents one of the most systematic attempts at mass brainwashing in human history, the Nazi campaign to capture the minds of Germany's children. Hitler understands intuitively what modern psychology confirms. Children's minds are extraordinarily malleable. "These boys and girls enter our organizations at 10 years of age," he declares, "and often for the first time get a little fresh air. After 4 years of the young folk, they go on to the Hitler Youth where we have them for another 4 years. And even if they are still not complete National Socialists, they go to labor service and are smoothed out there for another 6-7 months. And whatever class consciousness or social status might still be left, the Wehrmacht will take care of that." The Hitler Youth becomes far more than a political organization. It becomes a substitute family, religion, and identity for German children. At age 10, boys join the Deutsches Jungvolk, German young people, while girls enter the Jungmodellbund, Young Girls League. At 14, they advance to the Hitler Youth proper, where they remain until 18. By 1939, membership becomes legally mandatory for all German children. The program employs sophisticated psychological techniques to replace family and religious loyalty with devotion to the Nazi state. Children participate in elaborate initiation ceremonies that mimic religious confirmation, complete with sacred oaths and mystical symbolism. They receive special uniforms, badges, and ranks that make them feel important and chosen. Summer camps and weekend activities create intense group bonding experiences that forge lifelong emotional connections to Nazi ideology. Physical activities serve both practical and psychological purposes. Hiking, camping, and sports build healthy bodies while creating shared hardships that bond group members together. Military-style drills and competitions prepare boys for future Wehrmacht service while teaching absolute obedience to authority. Girls learn domestic skills and racial theory, preparing them for their role as mothers of the master race. The curriculum systematically rewrites German history and culture through a Nazi lens. Children learn that their highest loyalty belongs not to family or God, but to race and Führer. Traditional moral teachings about compassion and individual dignity are replaced with values of racial purity and national strength. Jewish children are expelled from youth organizations and schools, making anti-Semitism seem natural and normal. Nazi educators understand that children learn most effectively through emotional experience rather than rational argument. Stories, songs, and games convey Nazi ideology through exciting adventures and heroic examples. Children sing about brave German knights fighting Jewish enemies, play war games against imaginary foreign invaders, and compete in contests that reward Nazi loyalty and racial consciousness. The program also exploits children's natural desire to rebel against parental authority. Nazi youth leaders encourage children to report parents who express doubts about the regime or listen to foreign radio broadcasts. This creates a generation of informants within German families while teaching children that loyalty to Hitler supersedes traditional family bonds. Perhaps most tragically, the Hitler Youth succeeds in creating genuine enthusiasm for Nazi ideology among millions of German children. These aren't brainwashed zombies, but sincere believers who find meaning, friendship, and identity in the movement. They experience Nazi youth activities as the most exciting and important part of their lives, creating emotional investments that persist long after the regime's collapse. The effectiveness of youth indoctrination becomes apparent during World War II, when teenage Hitler Youth members fight with fanatical determination, even as Germany faces inevitable defeat. These child soldiers have been so thoroughly conditioned that death for the Führer seems preferable to surrender or compromise. The Nazi youth program reveals how quickly an entire generation can be psychologically captured through systematic manipulation of their deepest needs for belonging, purpose, and identity. It demonstrates that successful brainwashing doesn't require force or deception. It can be achieved through programs that genuinely satisfy human emotional and social needs while directing them toward destructive ends. Chapter 6. Social Engineering and Peer Pressure. The transformation begins subtly in neighborhoods across Germany. Frau Müller, a respected schoolteacher, notices that fewer colleagues greet her warmly in the faculty lounge. Her Jewish husband makes her suspect in their eyes, though no one speaks openly of this. Gradually, she finds herself isolated, defensive, and increasingly willing to prove her German loyalty through zealous support for Nazi policies. This scene illustrates one of the most powerful tools in Hitler's brainwashing arsenal: the systematic manipulation of social pressure and peer conformity. The Nazis understand that humans are fundamentally social creatures who will sacrifice their own judgment to maintain group acceptance. They weaponize this basic psychological need to transform German society from within. The Nazi Party creates multiple overlapping organizations that encompass virtually every aspect of German social life. Beyond the Hitler Youth, there are groups for women, farmers, workers, professionals, and hobbyists. These organizations provide social connections and community activities while simultaneously serving as surveillance networks and pressure groups for conformity. The regime employs a technique psychologists call social proof, the tendency for people to adopt behaviors they see others performing. Mass rallies, parades, and demonstrations create the impression that everyone supports Nazi policies enthusiastically. Germans who might privately harbor doubts see thousands of their neighbors cheering Hitler and conclude that resistance is futile or wrong. Workplace dynamics become particularly important in the social engineering project. Nazi organizations within businesses and professions create informal hierarchies based on party loyalty rather than competence or seniority. Promotions, job security, and social standing increasingly depend on demonstrating proper ideological commitment. This creates powerful incentives for public conformity, even among those who privately disagree. The regime also manipulates social status and prestige to reward Nazi loyalty. Party members receive special privileges, better housing, access to consumer goods, vacation opportunities, and social recognition. These benefits aren't primarily economic, but psychological, satisfying deep human needs for status and belonging. Germans learn that supporting Nazism brings social elevation while opposition leads to marginalization. Informant networks transform social relationships into tools of political control. The Nazis encouraged Germans to report suspicious behavior, disloyal comments, or insufficient enthusiasm for the regime. This creates an atmosphere of paranoia where people monitor their own speech and behavior constantly. More importantly, it makes every German complicit in the surveillance system, creating psychological investment in the regime's success. The manipulation of social pressure extends to intimate relationships and family life. The regime promotes marriages between racially pure Germans while prohibiting relationships across racial lines. Wedding ceremonies incorporate Nazi symbols and vows of service to the state. Children are encouraged to report parents who express doubts about Nazi policies, creating tension within families and making private dissent dangerous. Religious institutions face particular pressure to conform or face persecution. Protestant churches are forced into the German Christian movement, which attempts to reconcile Christianity with Nazi racial ideology. Catholic priests who resist face imprisonment or worse. These attacks on religious authority eliminate alternative sources of moral guidance while demonstrating the state's absolute power. The Nazis also create artificial community through shared rituals and celebrations. Mass events like the Nuremberg rallies, Hitler's birthday celebrations, and seasonal festivals bring Germans together in emotionally powerful experiences of unity and purpose. These events make participants feel connected to something larger than themselves, while associating those feelings with Nazi ideology. Perhaps most insidiously, the regime creates situations where Germans must repeatedly make small compromises that gradually erode their moral resistance. Buying from Jewish businesses becomes unpatriotic. Expressing sympathy for persecuted minorities becomes suspicious. Failing to participate in Nazi celebrations becomes antisocial. Each small accommodation makes the next one easier to rationalize. This systematic manipulation of social pressure succeeds because it exploits genuine human needs for community, status, and belonging. Germans don't simply submit to Nazi authority. They actively seek acceptance within Nazi social structures, transforming themselves in the process. Chapter 7. The Cult of the Führer. In living rooms across Germany, families pause their dinner conversations as Hitler's voice crackles through their radio speakers. Children stop playing. Adults lean forward with rapt attention. For the next hour, the voice of their Führer becomes the most important sound in their universe. This scene, repeated millions of times, illustrates the most personalized aspect of Nazi brainwashing: the transformation of Adolf Hitler from political leader into a godlike figure who commands absolute devotion. The creation of the Führer cult represents one of history's most successful personality cults, carefully engineered to exploit deep psychological needs for leadership, meaning, and transcendence. Hitler doesn't simply govern Germany. He becomes Germany in the minds of his followers, making opposition to his will seem like treason against the nation itself. Nazi propaganda portrays Hitler as a man of destiny, chosen by fate to restore German greatness. Official biographies emphasize his humble origins and early struggles, making him seem like a common man elevated by extraordinary circumstances. This narrative allows ordinary Germans to identify with Hitler while simultaneously viewing him as uniquely gifted and worthy of worship. The regime carefully controls Hitler's public image to maximize his mystical appeal. He appears in public rarely but dramatically, always in settings designed to emphasize his power and authority. Massive rallies, architectural backdrops, and orchestrated crowd responses create theater that transforms political speeches into religious experiences. Hitler becomes not just a speaker, but a performer in elaborate rituals of submission and adoration. Photography and film play crucial roles in building the Führer myth. Official images show Hitler as a man of action, reviewing troops, meeting with workers, playing with children, contemplating Germany's future in solitary dignity. These carefully staged photographs appear everywhere, making Hitler's presence feel constant and personal, even for Germans who never see him in person. The cult exploits Hitler's bachelor status to create the illusion of selfless devotion to Germany. Propaganda depicts him as a man who has sacrificed personal happiness for his people's welfare, married only to the German nation. This image allows followers to feel personally loved and cared for by their leader while justifying any demands he might make upon them. Nazi ideology presents Hitler as infallible, possessing supernatural insight into Germany's needs and destiny. His early political successes, the economic recovery, territorial expansion, and diplomatic victories are presented as proof of his divine mission. When later policies fail or create disasters, the blame falls on subordinates who failed to implement the Führer's perfect will correctly. The regime creates elaborate rituals of Führer worship that replace traditional religious practices. Hitler's birthday becomes a national holiday celebrated with more fervor than Christmas. His image appears in classrooms, offices, and homes alongside or instead of crucifixes. Children learn prayers that invoke Hitler's name and protection. These practices make Nazism feel like a religion rather than a political movement. Personal testimonies and letters to Hitler, carefully curated and publicized, create the impression of intimate relationship between leader and people. Germans read stories of mothers thanking the Führer for their son's military service, workers crediting him with their prosperity, and children promising him their devotion. These narratives make supporting Hitler feel like participating in a great love story between leader and nation. The Führer cult also exploits German cultural traditions of authority and obedience. Hitler becomes the ultimate father figure for a nation traumatized by defeat and chaos. His commands carry the weight of parental authority, making disobedience feel not just politically wrong but psychologically devastating. Perhaps most powerfully, the cult offers Germans a sense of vicarious greatness through identification with their leader. Hitler's victories become their victories, his genius their genius, his destiny their destiny. This psychological merger allows ordinary people to feel historically significant and racially superior through their connection to the Führer. The success of this personality cult makes rational evaluation of Nazi policies nearly impossible for many Germans. Criticizing specific actions means criticizing Hitler personally, which feels like betraying their own identity and significance. The Führer becomes so central to German self-conception that his fall would mean their own destruction. Chapter 8. Violence as a Tool. The brown-shirted SA stormtroopers march through Berlin streets, their boots echoing off cobblestones as they head toward a communist rally. Violence is about to erupt, but this isn't random street fighting. It's carefully orchestrated political theater designed to demonstrate Nazi power while intimidating opposition into silence. Violence becomes one of Hitler's most effective tools for reshaping German consciousness. The Nazis understand that violence serves multiple psychological functions beyond simple intimidation. Public brutality against designated enemies creates a sense of excitement and empowerment among supporters. Germans who feel humiliated by their nation's defeat can experience vicarious strength through Nazi violence against Jews, communists, and other scapegoats. Street fighting between Nazis and their opponents serves the regime's purposes, even when Nazis lose individual battles. The existence of constant conflict justifies extreme measures for restoring order. Germans who might otherwise oppose authoritarian policies become willing to accept them as necessary responses to social chaos that the Nazis themselves have created. The SA deliberately provokes confrontations with communist and social democratic groups, then presents these fights as evidence of leftist aggression against peaceful Germans. Nazi propaganda transforms instigated violence into defensive necessity, making brutality seem patriotic rather than criminal. This narrative manipulation allows supporters to maintain moral self-image while participating in or supporting atrocities. Violence also serves as a loyalty test for Nazi supporters. Participating in or witnessing attacks on regime enemies creates psychological investment in Nazi success. People who have committed violence for a cause become deeply committed to that cause's justification. Admitting the cause is wrong would mean accepting personal guilt for inexcusable actions. The regime escalates violence systematically, conditioning Germans to accept increasingly extreme measures. Early violence targets obviously political enemies like communist organizers. Later violence expands to include anyone who questions Nazi policies. Eventually, violence encompasses entire racial and ethnic groups. Each escalation seems logical given previous steps, preventing shock that might trigger resistance. Public executions and concentration camps serve as deterrent spectacles while normalizing extreme state violence. Germans learn that opposing the regime carries terrible consequences, but more importantly, they learn that such consequences are acceptable and normal. The state's willingness to use unlimited violence demonstrates its absolute power while desensitizing citizens to brutality. The Nazis also employ violence to break down traditional moral restraints. SS training deliberately includes participation in executions and other atrocities, creating psychological bonds among perpetrators while destroying normal human empathy. Soldiers and police officers who commit atrocities become psychologically dependent on Nazi ideology to justify their actions. Violence against designated enemies creates artificial unity among Germans. Shared participation in or tolerance of brutality bonds the in-group together while clearly defining the boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable populations. Germans who might disagree about economic policy or social issues find common ground in their shared hostility toward Nazi victims. The regime presents its violence as historically necessary and morally justified. Jews aren't murdered. They're eliminated as threats to German survival. Political opponents aren't imprisoned. They're quarantined to protect social health. This linguistic manipulation allows perpetrators and bystanders to maintain psychological comfort while participating in genocide. Perhaps most insidiously, the Nazis make violence seem normal and inevitable through gradual escalation and constant propaganda justification. Germans become accustomed to reading about arrests, deportations, and executions in their newspapers. What initially shocks becomes routine, creating psychological numbness that facilitates ever greater atrocities. The effectiveness of violence as a persuasion tool reveals uncomfortable truths about human psychology. People don't simply submit to violent authority, they often embrace it, finding meaning and identity in movements that promise them vicarious power over others. Violence doesn't just silence opposition. It actively creates supporters who become psychologically invested in the regime's survival. The ritualization of violence transforms brutality into sacred ceremony that bonds participants while providing meaning to their actions. SA and SS units develop elaborate initiation rites that include acts of violence against regime enemies. These rituals create brotherhood among perpetrators while making violence feel spiritually significant rather than merely criminal. During Kristallnacht, the November 1938 attacks on Jewish businesses and synagogues, local Nazi officials orchestrate violence with the precision of religious ceremony. The timing is coordinated across the country. The targets are carefully selected for maximum symbolic impact, and the participation follows established hierarchies and protocols. The ritualized nature of the violence serves multiple psychological functions. Participants experience the excitement of transgressing normal moral boundaries while feeling protected by group solidarity and official sanction. The ceremonial aspects transform criminal acts into expressions of higher purpose, allowing perpetrators to maintain heroic self-image while committing atrocities. Heinrich Müller, an SA member who participates in Kristallnacht, later writes, "Breaking the windows of the Jewish shops felt like striking a blow for Germany's freedom. We sang party songs as we marched through the streets, and the whole night felt like a celebration of our power and unity. I felt proud to be part of something so important and historic." The psychological conditioning that enables political violence begins long before actual attacks commence. Nazi rallies and parades create militaristic atmospheres where violence feels natural and necessary. Participants wear uniforms, march in formation, and chant slogans that dehumanize enemies while glorifying conflict. These pseudo-military experiences serve as training grounds for actual violence by familiarizing participants with hierarchical command structures, group solidarity, and enemy identification. The transition from symbolic to actual violence becomes psychologically easier when the organizational framework and ideological justification are already in place. The regime also employs what psychologists term moral disengagement to make violence psychologically acceptable. Perpetrators learn to view their actions through frameworks that eliminate moral responsibility. They're following orders, serving higher purposes, protecting innocent people, or responding to enemy aggression. This moral reframing proves especially powerful when combined with dehumanization of victims. Jews become vermin that must be exterminated for public health. Communists become cancer that must be cut out to save the nation. Political opponents become traitors who forfeit their right to humane treatment through their disloyalty. The language of medicine and pest control allows perpetrators to see themselves as healers and protectors rather than aggressors. Violence becomes treatment, killing becomes surgery, and mass murder becomes public health intervention. This medical metaphor provides psychological comfort while enabling escalating brutality. Dr. Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, explains this mindset in a 1943 speech. When a surgeon removes a cancer, he doesn't feel guilty about causing pain. He knows he's saving the patient's life. When we eliminate Jewish influence from German society, we're performing the same kind of necessary surgery to save our people's health. The regime's use of proxy violence allows ordinary Germans to benefit from brutality without directly participating in it. Professional enforcers, SA members, SS officers, police units carry out attacks while regular citizens maintain plausible deniability about their support for violence. This division of labor serves crucial psychological functions. Germans can express approval for regime goals while avoiding direct responsibility for the methods used to achieve them. They can benefit from Jewish property confiscation, communist suppression, and political intimidation while claiming they personally oppose violence. The psychological distance created by proxy violence makes mass complicity possible. Millions of Germans support or tolerate regime brutality because they don't personally pull triggers or swing clubs. The specialization of violence allows the majority to maintain moral comfort while enabling systematic atrocities. Martha Weber, a middle-class Berlin housewife, reflects this attitude in her diary. Of course, we don't approve of violence, but something had to be done about the communist threat and the Jewish problem. We're grateful that strong men are willing to do the difficult work that we couldn't do ourselves. The timing and targeting of Nazi violence reveals sophisticated understanding of how brutality can be used to shape public opinion and political behavior. Early violence focuses on unpopular groups, communists, criminals, and social outcasts, whose persecution generates little public sympathy. This creates acceptance for violent methods before applying them to broader populations. The regime also times major violent campaigns to coincide with political crises or international events that provide cover for escalation. The Rim Purge occurs during a period of factional conflict that makes violence seem necessary for party unity. Kristallnacht follows the assassination of a German diplomat, providing justification for spontaneous retaliation. This strategic timing prevents public shock that might generate opposition, while creating impression that violence responds to legitimate provocations rather than serving premeditated political purposes. Each violent episode appears reactive and justified rather than aggressive and planned. The demonstration effect of Nazi violence extends far beyond immediate victims to influence behavior throughout German society. Public beatings, arrests, and executions send clear messages about the consequences of opposition while advertising the regime's power and determination. Teachers, journalists, clergy, and other potential critics learn to self-censor rather than risk violent consequences. The mere possibility of brutality becomes more effective than actual violence at controlling behavior. The regime achieves compliance through fear without needing to attack every potential opponent directly. This psychological intimidation proves especially effective because the violence appears arbitrary and unpredictable. Germans can never be certain which behaviors might trigger retaliation, so they err on the side of caution by avoiding any actions that might be interpreted as disloyal. Pastor Dietrich Bonhoeffer captures this atmosphere in a letter. We live in constant uncertainty about what we can safely say or do. The rules change without warning, and yesterday's acceptable behavior becomes today's punishable offense. This uncertainty makes everyone cautious about expressing any opinions that might be misconstrued as criticism. The sexual dimension of Nazi violence reveals how brutality can be used to assert dominance while satisfying psychological needs for power and control. Sexual assault becomes a weapon of political intimidation, particularly against women associated with regime enemies. The threat of rape functions as punishment for disloyalty while demonstrating masculine Nazi power. During the early years of Nazi rule, SA members frequently assault women suspected of relationships with Jewish men or communist activists. These attacks serve multiple purposes: punishing race mixing, intimidating potential opponents, and providing sadistic gratification for perpetrators. The sexual aspect of political violence creates additional psychological barriers to resistance. Women must consider not only physical safety, but sexual violation when deciding whether to oppose the regime. Families become cautious about exposing female members to retribution through political activism. The regime's tolerance for sexual violence also signals broader abandonment of traditional moral constraints. If Nazi supporters can commit rape with impunity, then other forms of brutality become more psychologically acceptable. Sexual violence serves as a gateway to more extreme forms of atrocity. The economic integration of violence into Nazi political strategy reveals how brutality can serve material as well as psychological purposes. Attacks on Jewish businesses create opportunities for German competitors to acquire market share and property. Violence becomes profitable for supporters while imposing costs on opponents. This economic dimension of violence creates powerful incentives for participation while making opposition expensive. Germans who profit from Jewish persecution develop material stakes in continued violence, while those who might defend victims face economic losses as well as physical danger. The systematic destruction of Jewish businesses during boycotts and Kristallnacht directly benefits German competitors who inherit customers, contracts, and market position. These economic rewards make violence seem beneficial rather than merely destructive, creating rational incentives for supporting brutality. Local Nazi officials often coordinate violent campaigns with business interests to maximize economic benefits for supporters. Attacks are timed to coincide with business cycles, target specific competitors, and create opportunities for property acquisition at below market prices. Franz Kaufmann, a German shopkeeper who acquires a Jewish competitor's business after Kristallnacht, later admits, "I didn't personally attack anyone, but I benefited enormously when the Goldstein family was forced to sell their store for almost nothing. My family's prosperity came from other people's suffering. I knew it even then." The bureaucratization of violence allows the regime to systematize brutality while maintaining administrative efficiency and legal formality. Violence becomes processed through official channels with proper paperwork, approval procedures, and record-keeping requirements. This bureaucratic approach serves multiple psychological functions. It makes violence seem legitimate and lawful rather than criminal and arbitrary. It distributes responsibility across multiple officials and departments, reducing individual guilt. It creates institutional momentum that makes stopping violence administratively difficult. The development of concentration camps exemplifies this bureaucratization of brutality. What begins as improvised detention facilities for political prisoners evolves into systematically administered institutions with formal procedures, standardized operations, and professional management. Camp administration follows normal bureaucratic practices: budget allocations, personnel policies, supply procurement, and performance evaluation. Guards receive training, prisoners are processed according to regulations, and operations are documented with meticulous detail. This administrative normality make systematic brutality feel routine and acceptable. The international dimension of Nazi violence reveals how brutality can be used to communicate messages to foreign audiences while building domestic support through demonstrated strength. High-profile attacks on regime enemies signal determination to international observers while proving Nazi power to domestic supporters. The regime carefully calibrates international reactions to its violence, escalating gradually to test foreign tolerance while avoiding immediate intervention. Early violence against Germans generates little international response, encouraging further escalation against more sympathetic victims. The lack of meaningful international consequences for Nazi violence teaches Germans that the broader world either approves of regime brutality or lacks the power to prevent it. This international acquiescence legitimizes violence while encouraging supporters to believe in Nazi strength and opponents to abandon hope for outside intervention. Adolf Eichmann later reflects on this international dimension. We learned that the world didn't really care what we did to Jews and other enemies. Their protests were just words without action. This taught us that we could proceed with our plans without serious interference from abroad. The educational aspects of Nazi violence reveal how brutality can be used to teach political lessons while conditioning populations to accept authoritarian rule. Public executions, mass arrests, and violent demonstrations serve as civic education that communicates regime values and expectations. Citizens learn through observation of violence that the state possesses unlimited power, that resistance is futile, that designated enemies deserve punishment, and that survival requires conformity. These lessons are internalized more effectively through dramatic demonstration than through abstract propaganda. The regime also uses violence to educate specific audiences about their proper roles and relationships. Attacks on intellectuals teach that independent thinking is dangerous. Violence against clergy demonstrates that religious authority must submit to political power. Brutality against women shows that traditional gender protections have been suspended for regime enemies. These educational functions make violence serve long-term political goals beyond immediate intimidation. Citizens who witness or learn about regime brutality internalize lessons about power, authority, and survival that shape their behavior for years afterward. The psychological legacy of Nazi violence extends far beyond the immediate victims to influence German consciousness and behavior patterns for generations. Exposure to systematic brutality creates trauma, guilt, and moral confusion that persists long after the violence ends. Germans who witnessed, participated in, or benefited from regime violence carry psychological scars that affect their relationships, political attitudes, and moral reasoning. The normalization of brutality makes it difficult to establish clear ethical boundaries, while complicity in violence creates defensive denial that prevents honest reckoning with the past. Children who grow up surrounded by political violence learn that brutality is normal and acceptable when serving approved purposes. These early lessons about the relationship between power and violence influence their adult attitudes toward authority, conflict resolution, and human rights. The regime's systematic use of violence as a tool of persuasion ultimately succeeds in reshaping German consciousness about the relationship between power, morality, and political legitimacy. Violence becomes normalized, justified, and even celebrated when serving nationalist purposes, creating psychological conditions that enable genocide and aggressive war. This transformation reveals how quickly civilized societies can be conditioned to accept and support extreme brutality when violence is systematically integrated into political strategy and ideological justification. The Nazi experience demonstrates that violence isn't simply a tool of control, but a means of psychological transformation that can remake entire populations' understanding of right and wrong. Chapter 9. Economic Manipulation. The Mercedes factory in Stuttgart hums with activity as German workers assemble luxury automobiles, destined for party officials and foreign export. Employment has surged since Hitler's rise to power, and wages are rising steadily. For many Germans, this economic revival proves the Führer's genius and justifies their political support. But this prosperity rests on carefully concealed foundations of manipulation, debt, and preparation for aggressive war. Hitler understands that economic conditions powerfully influence political loyalty. Hungry, unemployed people become desperate for any leader who promises improvement, while prosperous citizens tend to support whatever system brings them comfort. The Nazis deliberately engineer economic policies designed to maximize political support rather than genuine long-term prosperity. The regime's economic strategy begins with massive public works projects that provide immediate employment for millions of Germans. The construction of the Autobahn highway system becomes the most visible symbol of Nazi achievement, providing jobs while creating infrastructure that will serve military purposes in future wars. These projects generate genuine economic activity while demonstrating the state's power to create change. Rearmament provides the hidden engine of German economic recovery. Military spending soars from virtually nothing to consuming a quarter of Germany's national income by 1938. This spending creates employment in steel, chemicals, aircraft, and other industries while preparing for the aggressive wars that Hitler has planned from the beginning. Germans see rising prosperity without understanding its unsustainable foundations. The Nazis also manipulate labor relations to create the illusion of worker empowerment while actually strengthening state control. Independent trade unions are destroyed and replaced by the German Labor Front, which promises to represent worker interests while actually serving regime needs. Wages are controlled, strikes are prohibited, but workers receive symbolic benefits like subsidized vacations and entertainment that make them feel valued. Consumer policy becomes a tool for building political support through carefully managed material improvements. The Volkswagen program promises every German family an affordable automobile through a savings plan that generates massive government revenue while delivering few actual cars. Germans feel they're participating in national prosperity even when actual consumption remains limited. Agricultural policy demonstrates the regime's willingness to sacrifice economic efficiency for political control. Small farmers, a key Nazi constituency, receive protection from foreign competition and debt relief that keeps them loyal to the party. This policy costs consumers through higher food prices while maintaining the political support of rural Germans who might otherwise oppose Nazi policies. The regime's economic nationalism appeals to German pride while serving political purposes. Imports are restricted not just for economic reasons, but to demonstrate German self-sufficiency and superiority. Buy German campaigns make consumption choices feel like patriotic duties while building psychological investment in the regime's success. Currency manipulation and debt financing allow the Nazis to fund their programs without immediately raising taxes or cutting consumption. Complex financial instruments hide the true cost of rearmament while maintaining the illusion of fiscal responsibility. Germans enjoy rising living standards without understanding that their children will bear the ultimate cost through war and destruction. The regime also uses economic policy to reward supporters and punish enemies. Jewish businesses face boycotts, legal restrictions, and eventual confiscation, while their assets are redistributed to loyal Germans. This creates material incentives for anti-Semitism while making ordinary Germans complicit in Jewish persecution through economic participation. Perhaps most importantly, the Nazis tie economic success directly to political loyalty and racial ideology. Germans learn that their prosperity depends on maintaining Nazi rule and pursuing Nazi policies. Economic well-being becomes proof of Aryan superiority and justification for aggressive expansion to secure additional resources and markets. The manipulation succeeds because it addresses genuine economic needs while creating psychological investment in Nazi ideology. Germans who benefit from the regime's policies become defenders of those policies even when they might otherwise oppose Nazi violence or authoritarianism. Economic self-interest aligns with political loyalty, creating powerful motivation for continued support. This economic manipulation reveals how material prosperity can become a tool of political control when carefully managed by sophisticated propagandists. The regime's economic achievements feel real to Germans because they are real in the short term, even though they rest on unsustainable foundations that will eventually collapse in war and defeat. The deeper architecture of Nazi economic manipulation extends far beyond simple job creation and public works projects. The regime systematically restructures German capitalism to serve political purposes while creating the illusion of continued free enterprise. Private businesses remain nominally independent, but their operations become increasingly subordinated to state planning and ideological objectives. The four-year plan, announced in 1936, represents the most comprehensive attempt to coordinate economic activity with political goals. Ostensibly designed to achieve economic self-sufficiency, the plan actually prepares Germany for aggressive war by prioritizing military production over consumer goods. Hermann Göring, who oversees the plan, makes its true purpose clear. Guns will make us powerful. Butter will only make us fat. This massive economic mobilization requires sophisticated techniques for managing public opinion and maintaining popular support despite declining living standards. The regime employs what economists later term ersatz economics, the substitution of inferior goods for quality products while maintaining the appearance of prosperity and progress. Coffee becomes ersatz coffee made from acorns and barley. Butter gives way to margarine made from whale oil. Wool clothing is replaced by synthetic fabrics that tear easily and provide little warmth. Yet Nazi propaganda presents these substitutions as innovations demonstrating German scientific superiority and independence from foreign suppliers. The psychology behind ersatz economics reveals how authoritarian regimes can manipulate public perception of material conditions through careful framing and nationalist appeal. Germans learn to take pride in their sacrifice for the greater good, while viewing their declining consumption as evidence of virtue rather than failure. Frau Schmidt, a Berlin housewife, writes in her diary, "The ersatz coffee tastes terrible, but I drink it knowing that every cup demonstrates our independence from Jewish-controlled international trade. My sacrifice helps build German strength and shows the world that we don't need their products to prosper." The regime's labor policies create the illusion of worker empowerment while actually increasing state control over every aspect of employment. The German labor front becomes a massive bureaucracy that regulates wages, working conditions, housing, and even leisure activities for millions of German workers. This comprehensive control allows the regime to direct labor resources toward military production while preventing strikes or other forms of worker resistance. The Strength Through Joy program epitomizes the Nazi approach to labor manipulation. This organization provides subsidized vacations, cultural events, and recreational activities that make workers feel valued and rewarded for their loyalty. Workers can cruise the Mediterranean, attend opera performances, or vacation in the Alps at prices they could never afford under normal market conditions. But these programs serve multiple purposes beyond simple worker satisfaction. They create grateful dependence on the regime for life's pleasures while demonstrating the state's benevolent power. They also provide surveillance opportunities, as workers' leisure activities become occasions for monitoring political attitudes and reporting suspicious behavior. Hans Müller, a factory worker in Dusseldorf, later reflects, "The Strength Through Joy cruise to Norway was the best vacation of my life. I had never traveled outside Germany before, and the ship was like a luxury hotel. We were treated like aristocrats for 2 weeks. How could I not support a government that made such experiences possible for ordinary workers? The Volkswagen savings scheme represents perhaps the most cynical example of Nazi economic manipulation. Marketed as the people's car that would democratize automobile ownership, the program requires workers to purchase savings stamps worth 5 marks per week until they accumulate 990 marks for a car. The slogan, Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Wagen, one people, one Reich, one car, makes car ownership seem like a patriotic duty and proof of national progress. By 1939, over 300,000 Germans have paid into the program, generating 280 million marks in government revenue. But fewer than 1,000 cars are actually delivered to civilian customers. The vast majority of production goes to military vehicles, while civilian savers receive nothing but promises and propaganda about their future automobiles. The psychological impact of the Volkswagen program extends far beyond its economic effects. Participants develop emotional investment in the regime's success because their personal dreams depend on continued Nazi rule. Every weekly payment becomes an act of faith in the system, while any doubt about the program's viability implies doubt about the regime itself. The scheme also creates a sense of shared national purpose and progress. Workers across Germany participate in the same program, save at the same rate, and dream of the same future mobility. This collective participation makes individual Germans feel connected to a larger movement while reinforcing the illusion that Nazi policies benefit ordinary people rather than serving elite interests. The regime's manipulation of credit and debt markets demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how financial instruments can serve political purposes. The Nazis develop Mefo bills, a complex form of government debt disguised as private commercial paper that allows massive deficit spending, without appearing to violate fiscal constraints or alarming foreign creditors. These financial instruments enable the regime to fund rearmament and public works projects without raising taxes or cutting popular programs. The debt remains hidden from public view, allowing Germans to enjoy improved living standards without understanding the true cost of their prosperity. The bills also provide flexibility for economic planning while maintaining the appearance of sound fiscal management. Dr. Hjalmar Schacht, the Nazi finance minister who develops these schemes, later explains their political logic. The German people needed to see immediate improvements in their economic situation to support the new government. But we also needed massive resources for rearmament and preparation for war. The Mefo bills allowed us to have both without forcing painful choices that might undermine popular support. The manipulation of foreign trade and currency policy serves both economic and psychological purposes. The regime negotiates bilateral trade agreements with smaller European and Latin American countries that create the impression of German economic strength and international acceptance. These agreements often involve barter arrangements that allow Germany to acquire raw materials without spending scarce foreign currency. More importantly, these trade relationships demonstrate to Germans that their country has escaped international isolation and regained respect as a major power. The psychological impact of renewed international economic relationships helps legitimize the regime while building confidence in its ability to achieve national greatness. The autarky campaign, the drive toward economic self-sufficiency, appeals to deep German desires for independence and security while serving the regime as war preparation goals. Germans are told that economic dependence on foreign countries makes them vulnerable to manipulation and betrayal, while self-sufficiency ensures both security and dignity. This nationalist economic message resonates powerfully with a population that has experienced the trauma of economic collapse and foreign humiliation after World War I. The promise of never again facing such vulnerability creates strong emotional support for policies that might otherwise seem economically irrational. The regime's treatment of private business reveals how authoritarian systems can maintain the appearance of free enterprise while subordinating economic activity to political control. Large corporations retain private ownership and formal independence, but their operations become increasingly directed by state planning and ideological requirements. Companies that cooperate with regime goals receive government contracts, favorable tax treatment, and protection from competition. Those that resist face harassment, boycotts, and eventual expropriation. This system of rewards and punishments ensures business compliance without requiring formal nationalization that might alarm domestic or international opinion. Fritz Thyssen, a major industrialist who initially supports the Nazis, later describes the transformation. "We thought we could use the party for our own purposes and maintain control over our businesses. Instead, we discovered that the party was using us." Every major business decision required political approval, and economic logic became subordinate to ideological imperatives. The regime also exploits gender roles and family structures to maximize the economic benefits of its policies while minimizing their costs. Women are encouraged to leave the workforce and focus on domestic responsibilities, ostensibly to preserve traditional family values, but actually to free up jobs for unemployed men who might otherwise become politically dangerous. This policy reduces unemployment statistics while avoiding the need to create actual productive employment for millions of workers. Women who lose their jobs don't appear in unemployment figures, making the regime's economic performance seem more impressive than it actually is. The marriage loan program exemplifies this gendered approach to economic manipulation. This program serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It reduces female employment, encourages population growth for military purposes, stimulates demand for household goods, and creates emotional attachment to regime policies through personal financial benefits. Young couples become stakeholders in Nazi success because their personal economic well-being depends on continued party rule. The regime's approach to taxation demonstrates how fiscal policy can serve propaganda purposes while disguising the true cost of government programs. Rather than imposing direct tax increases that would be politically unpopular, the Nazis rely heavily on indirect taxes, hidden fees, and forced contributions that are less visible to ordinary citizens. Workers pay compulsory contributions to the German Labor Front, the Winter Relief Fund, and various party organizations. These payments function as taxes but are presented as voluntary expressions of patriotic solidarity. Citizens feel they are contributing to worthy causes rather than bearing increased tax burdens. The Winter Relief Campaign becomes a particularly powerful tool for building regime support while extracting resources from the population. Citizens are encouraged to donate money, food, and clothing for needy Germans during the winter months. The campaign generates substantial revenue while creating the impression of national solidarity and regime compassion for the poor. More insidiously, participation in winter relief becomes a test of political loyalty. Those who fail to contribute adequately face social pressure and potential consequences for their careers and social standing. The campaign transforms charity into political coercion while maintaining the appearance of voluntary civic engagement. The regime's control over information about economic conditions allows it to shape public perception of its policies. Success regardless of actual outcomes. Statistical reporting becomes a tool of propaganda rather than analysis, with figures manipulated or selectively presented to support regime claims about economic achievement. Unemployment statistics exclude women, Jews, political prisoners, and others who are removed from the workforce through discrimination rather than job creation. Production figures emphasize military goods and heavy industry, while downplaying consumer shortages. Trade statistics highlight bilateral agreements while obscuring the country's deteriorating foreign currency position. This statistical manipulation succeeds because most Germans lack access to independent economic analysis or comparative data from other countries. They must rely on regime-controlled media for information about economic conditions, making it difficult to evaluate government claims critically. The psychological impact of economic manipulation extends far beyond immediate material benefits to create lasting changes in German attitudes toward authority, individual responsibility, and moral behavior. Citizens learn to subordinate personal economic interests to state directives while accepting reduced personal freedom as the price of material security. The regime's economic policies also create powerful vested interests in continued Nazi rule among key constituencies. Farmers benefit from price supports and debt relief. Workers gain employment and social benefits. Businesses receive government contracts and protection from competition. These material benefits create rational incentives for political support, even among those who might otherwise oppose Nazi ideology. Perhaps most significantly, the economic manipulation demonstrates how authoritarian regimes can exploit the legitimate needs and desires of ordinary people to build support for destructive policies. Germans genuinely need employment, security, and prosperity, and the Nazi regime provides these things, at least temporarily. The regime's economic success makes its other policies seem more credible and acceptable, creating psychological space for escalating extremism and violence. The ultimate tragedy of Nazi economic manipulation lies not in its failure, but in its success. The regime does improve material conditions for many Germans in the short term, making their support seem rational, and their later claims of ignorance about regime criminality seem self-serving. The economic achievements provide both justification for supporting the regime and psychological cover for ignoring its moral crimes. This economic manipulation reveals fundamental truths about the relationship between material conditions and political loyalty in democratic societies. Citizens who feel economically secure and prosperous are more likely to support existing institutions and leaders, even when those leaders pursue policies that conflict with democratic values or human rights. The Nazi economic experience demonstrates how skilled demagogues can exploit this relationship to build support for authoritarian rule through policies that provide short-term benefits while creating long-term catastrophe. The lessons remain relevant for contemporary democracies facing economic stress and political polarization, revealing the continuing importance of maintaining both prosperity and vigilance in protecting democratic institutions and values. Chapter 10. The Final Solution. Wannsee, January 20th, 1942. 15 well-dressed bureaucrats gather in a comfortable villa overlooking a frozen lake to discuss administrative details of mass murder. These aren't wild-eyed fanatics but educated professionals, lawyers, doctors, civil servants, calmly planning the systematic extermination of European Jewry. This scene represents the horrifying culmination of Nazi brainwashing, the transformation of ordinary people into willing participants in genocide. The Holocaust doesn't begin with death camps, but with psychological preparation that makes mass murder seem necessary and acceptable. Years of propaganda, legal discrimination, and social conditioning have gradually redefined Jews as existential threats to German survival. By 1942, many Germans genuinely believe that Jewish extermination represents defensive action rather than aggressive violence. The Wannsee Conference reveals the bureaucratic machinery that makes genocide possible on an industrial scale. The attendees aren't discussing whether to kill Jews. That decision has already been made at higher levels. Instead, they coordinate the logistics of mass murder with the same professional competence they might apply to any large-scale administrative project. Reinhard Heydrich, the conference organizer, presents killing quotas and deportation schedules with charts and statistics. Countries are evaluated based on their Jewish populations and the ease of organizing deportations. Technical problems are discussed and solutions proposed. The language remains clinical and euphemistic throughout, referring to evacuation, resettlement, and appropriate treatment rather than murder. This bureaucratic approach serves multiple psychological functions for the participants. By focusing on administrative efficiency rather than human consequences, they can maintain emotional distance from their actions' true meaning. The complex organizational structure distributes responsibility so widely that no individual feels fully accountable for the final result. Dr. Wilhelm Stuckert, a lawyer representing the Interior Ministry, later testifies, "We were solving a technical problem that had been assigned to us by higher authority. My role was to ensure that the legal framework supported the administrative requirements. I focused on the procedural questions, not the ultimate purpose." The conference participants represent the cream of German professional society, men with advanced degrees, successful careers, and social standing. Their willingness to plan genocide reveals how professional competence can become divorced from moral consideration when institutional authority provides direction and justification. The meeting's tone remains cordial and businesslike throughout. Participants discuss mass murder over lunch and cognac, treating it as routine government business. This normalization of the extraordinary makes participation psychologically easier, while demonstrating how institutional context can make even genocide seem mundane. The path to industrialized murder reveals the systematic process by which Nazi Germany gradually escalated from discrimination to extermination. Each step in this progression built upon previous steps while introducing new psychological and practical challenges that required innovative solutions. The earliest killings occur in conquered Polish territories, where SS Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, shoot Jewish civilians in mass executions. These operations quickly reveal practical and psychological problems with face-to-face murder. Many German soldiers suffer mental breakdowns from directly killing women and children, while the logistics of shooting millions of people prove inefficient and psychologically unsustainable. Heinrich Himmler himself becomes ill while observing a mass shooting in Minsk, leading him to seek methods that would be less traumatic for German perpetrators. The search for more humane killing methods, humane for the killers, not the victims, drives the development of gas chambers and industrial murder facilities. The T4 euthanasia program provides both technical expertise and psychological preparation for later genocide. Beginning in 1939, this program systematically murders disabled Germans in facilities designed to look like hospitals. The techniques developed gas chambers disguised as shower rooms, crematoria for body disposal, and bureaucratic procedures for concealing murder, later transferred directly to the Holocaust. Dr. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and a leader in the euthanasia program, explains the psychological rationale. "We convinced ourselves that we were ending suffering and improving the race." The patients were portrayed as lives not worth living, burdens on their families and society. Killing them seemed like a mercy to them and a benefit to Germany. The progression from euthanasia to genocide follows a predictable psychological pattern. Once the principle of state-sponsored killing is established for one group, it becomes easier to extend to others. The infrastructure, personnel, and psychological barriers have already been overcome, making expansion seem logical rather than revolutionary. The men and women who carry out the Holocaust represent a cross-section of German society, rather than a collection of sadistic psychopaths. Understanding their psychological motivations reveals disturbing truths about human nature and the conditions that enable ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. Some perpetrators genuinely believe in Nazi racial ideology and see their actions as serving a higher purpose. These true believers view themselves as soldiers in a cosmic struggle between good and evil, protecting civilization from Jewish destruction. For them, mass murder becomes a sacred duty performed for the benefit of humanity. SS Führer Otto Hoffmann writes to his wife, The work is difficult and sometimes heartbreaking. But we must remember that we are saving the German people and the world from a terrible fate. Future generations will thank us for our courage to do what others could not. Others participate in genocide primarily to advance their careers within Nazi institutions. The Holocaust creates opportunities for promotion, recognition, and professional advancement that ambitious individuals find difficult to resist. The systematic nature of the killing apparatus makes technical competence more important than ideological fervor. Rudolf Hess, commandant of Auschwitz, later testifies, "I wanted to prove myself as an efficient administrator." The camp's operations were judged by productivity metrics. How many people could be processed, how quickly operations could be completed, how much cost could be reduced. I took professional pride in optimization. Many perpetrators participate because they cannot bear to appear weak or unreliable in front of their comrades. The power of group dynamics makes individual resistance psychologically difficult, particularly in military or paramilitary organizations where group solidarity is essential for survival. Reserve Police Battalion 101, composed of ordinary Hamburg policemen, participates in mass shootings in Poland despite having no prior experience with violence. Major Wilhelm Trapp offers his men the opportunity to opt out of killing duties, but fewer than a dozen of 500 men accept. Most participate because they fear being seen as cowards or unreliable by their colleagues. The process of gradual desensitization proves crucial in transforming ordinary people into mass murderers. Perpetrators don't begin by killing children and elderly civilians. They start with tasks that seem less morally problematic and gradually escalate to more extreme violence. This psychological conditioning process makes each step seem logical given previous actions while preventing moral shock that might trigger resistance. Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka, describes his progression. "I began by organizing deportation schedules from the Reich Security main office. Then I supervised the construction of facilities. By the time actual killing began, I had been involved in the process for months. Each step seemed to follow naturally from the previous one. The regime employs sophisticated psychological techniques to facilitate participation in genocide while protecting perpetrators' self-image. Mass murder is disguised through euphemistic language that allows participants to maintain psychological distance from their actions' true nature. Participants talk about processing, special treatment, and resettlement rather than murder, making their work seem like administrative routine rather than genocide. Division of labor spreads responsibility among thousands of participants, making individual guilt seem minimal. Train conductors transport victims, clerks process paperwork, guards maintain order, and technicians operate gas chambers. Each person performs a small role in the larger process, allowing them to avoid confronting their participation in mass murder. The bureaucratic structure of the Holocaust creates what Hannah Arendt later terms the banality of evil. The transformation of genocide into routine administrative procedure performed by ordinary civil servants following proper protocols. Adolf Eichmann, who organizes deportation logistics, presents himself at his trial as a mere transportation specialist who never personally killed anyone. This compartmentalization allows perpetrators to focus on technical efficiency rather than human consequences. They can take professional pride in solving logistical problems, meeting quotas, and optimizing operations without confronting the reality that their competence serves mass murder. The regime also exploits human psychological tendencies toward obedience to authority, particularly in hierarchical organizations like the military and civil service. Perpetrators learn to see their actions as following legitimate orders from properly constituted authority, rather than making independent moral choices. Dr. Hans Munch, an SS physician at Auschwitz, later explains, "We were told that this was a military operation essential for German survival. Questioning orders wasn't just insubordination. It was treason against the fatherland during wartime. The entire institutional structure reinforced the message that obedience was our highest duty. The systematic dehumanization of victims makes killing psychologically easier by eliminating empathy and moral consideration. Years of propaganda have portrayed Jews as subhuman parasites, disease carriers, and existential threats to German survival. By the time systematic killing begins, many perpetrators genuinely see their victims as dangerous enemies rather than innocent human beings. Guards at concentration camps are trained to view prisoners as criminals and security threats who deserve harsh treatment. The camp's deliberate degradation of prisoners, through starvation, disease, and brutal conditions, makes them appear less human to their captors, reinforcing propaganda stereotypes and making violence seem justified. Victor Brack, involved in the euthanasia program, writes, "We learn to see our patients not as individuals with hopes and fears, but as genetic defects that threaten the health of the race." Medical terminology helped us maintain scientific objectivity about what others might see as human tragedy. The physical separation of perpetrators from victims also facilitates mass killing by preventing personal relationships that might generate empathy. The industrial nature of death camps allows for mass murder without individual contact between killers and victims. Gas chambers are operated remotely, cremation is mechanized, and personal possessions are processed separately from bodies. Even in face-to-face killings, perpetrators develop psychological techniques for maintaining emotional distance. Alcohol consumption before executions helps numb emotional responses. Focusing on technical aspects of killing, proper shooting techniques, efficient disposal methods, accurate record keeping, allows perpetrators to avoid confronting the human reality of their actions. The regime creates powerful incentives for participation in genocide while imposing severe costs for resistance. Perpetrators receive extra rations, better housing, professional advancement, and social recognition for their service. Meanwhile, those who refuse to participate face court-martial, imprisonment, social ostracism, and career destruction. These incentive structures create rational reasons for participation, even among those who might privately doubt the morality of their actions. The costs of resistance seem far greater than the benefits, particularly when resistance appears futile given the systematic nature of the killing apparatus. SS training systematically breaks down normal moral inhibitions against violence through gradually escalating brutality. New recruits begin with relatively minor acts of cruelty and progressively commit more serious violence. This conditioning process creates psychological investment in the organization while destroying empathy and moral sensitivity. Heinrich Himmler explains the psychological strategy in a 1943 speech. "We had the moral right. We had the duty to our people to destroy this people which wanted to destroy us. We have exterminated a bacterium because we do not want in the end to be infected by the bacterium and die of it." The language of medical intervention and pest control allows perpetrators to see themselves as healers and protectors rather than murderers. Jews become a disease requiring treatment, a pest requiring extermination, a cancer requiring surgical removal. This medical metaphor transforms killing into healing and makes perpetrators feel virtuous about their participation in genocide. Group solidarity among perpetrators creates powerful psychological bonds that override individual moral qualms. Men who kill together develop intense loyalty to each other and to their shared mission. The shared experience of extreme violence creates what sociologists call combat brotherhood that makes betraying the group psychologically impossible. These bonds are reinforced through ritual and ceremony that give meaning to violence. SS units conduct elaborate initiation ceremonies, wear special uniforms and insignia, and participate in group activities that reinforce their elite identity. Participation in genocide becomes a mark of honor and courage rather than shame and criminality. The regime also exploits family loyalties to motivate participation in genocide. Perpetrators are told that they are protecting their wives and children from Jewish threats. The sacrifice involved in killing becomes a gift to future generations who will live in a world free from Jewish influence. Dr. Mengele writes to his family, "The work here is difficult and sometimes disturbing, but I know that I am securing a better future for you and for all German families. The children you raise will live in a world where genetic diseases and racial contamination no longer threaten our people's health." Women play crucial supporting roles in the Holocaust through their work as nurses, secretaries, guards, and administrators. Their participation helps normalize genocide by making it seem like ordinary work that decent people can perform. Female involvement also contradicts traditional assumptions about women's nurturing nature, demonstrating how institutional contexts can override gender-based moral expectations. Irma Gries, a female guard at Bergen-Belsen, later testifies, "I was told that I was serving the fatherland by maintaining order and discipline among dangerous criminals. The work seemed no different from police work or prison administration. We were protecting society from harmful elements." The psychological transformation of perpetrators reveals how institutional context can corrupt even well-educated, professionally successful individuals. Doctors who had sworn to do no harm conduct deadly medical experiments. Lawyers who had studied justice organize deportations. Teachers who had nurtured children participate in their murder. This corruption occurs through the gradual redefinition of professional ethics to serve regime goals. Medical ethics are reinterpreted to emphasize racial health over individual welfare. Legal principles are modified to prioritize state security over individual rights. Educational philosophy is revised to emphasize obedience over critical thinking. The involvement of religious institutions and personnel in the Holocaust demonstrates how spiritual authority can be corrupted to serve genocidal purposes. Some Christian churches actively support Nazi racial policies, while others remain silent about obvious moral outrages. This religious complicity helps legitimize genocide by suggesting that killing Jews serves divine will. Father Bernhard Stempfel, a priest involved in Nazi ideology, preaches, "The elimination of Jewish influence represents God's will for protecting Christian civilization. We are instruments of divine justice, carrying out the Lord's plan for purifying the world of corrupting influences." The psychological techniques that enable the Holocaust reveal fundamental truths about human nature and the conditions that make genocide possible. Ordinary people can be transformed into mass murderers through systematic manipulation of their basic psychological needs and weaknesses. The desire for meaning and purpose can be redirected toward destructive ends when channeled through powerful ideological narratives. Professional competence can serve evil when divorced from moral consideration. Group loyalty can override individual conscience when institutional pressure becomes overwhelming. Authority obedience can enable atrocity when legitimate institutions provide genocidal direction. The Holocaust succeeds because it exploits normal human psychology rather than requiring abnormal individuals. The same psychological mechanisms that enable cooperation, professional achievement, and social solidarity can be manipulated to serve mass murder when channeled through sophisticated institutional structures. Perhaps most disturbing, many perpetrators maintain their sense of moral virtue throughout their participation in genocide. They genuinely believe they are serving higher purposes, protecting innocent people, and performing necessary duties. This moral certainty makes resistance nearly impossible and reconciliation extremely difficult. The psychological preparation for genocide reveals how democratic societies remain vulnerable to manipulation by leaders who understand human psychological weaknesses and possess the institutional power to exploit them systematically. The techniques employed by Nazi Germany represent a template that ambitious authoritarians can adapt to different times. places, and target populations. The transformation of ordinary Germans into willing participants in genocide stands as history's most comprehensive demonstration of how quickly civilized people can be conditioned to accept and participate in the most extreme forms of evil when subjected to systematic psychological manipulation by totalitarian institutions. Chapter 11. The Collapse and Reckoning. Berlin, April 1945. Soviet artillery pounds the capital of the Thousand-Year Reich as Hitler huddles in his underground bunker, still issuing orders to armies that no longer exist. Above ground, German civilians emerge from their shelters to face a reality that their years of indoctrination never prepared them for: total defeat and the complete collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. The end of Nazi Germany forces a brutal psychological reckoning for millions of Germans who had internalized the regime's worldview. The man they worshipped as a divine leader commits suicide rather than face capture. The racial superiority they had embraced becomes a source of international shame. The enemies they had demonized now stand as their conquerors and judges. The fall of Nazi Germany creates what psychologists would later term cognitive dissonance on a massive scale. For 12 years, Germans have been told that their race is superior, their cause is just, and their victory is inevitable. Now they face the undeniable evidence that everything they believed was wrong. The psychological impact proves devastating for millions who had built their entire identity around Nazi ideology. In the final months of the war, many Germans experience what can only be described as psychological breakdown. Diaries and letters from the period reveal people struggling to reconcile their deeply held beliefs with overwhelming contrary evidence. Some retreat into fantasy, continuing to believe in secret weapons or last-minute salvation even as enemy tanks roll through their streets. Others simply shut down emotionally, becoming catatonic in the face of reality they cannot process. The regime's propaganda machine, which had been so effective at shaping German consciousness, suddenly becomes a liability. Germans who had been taught to see themselves as racially superior must now confront their status as a defeated and despised people. Those who had been promised a thousand-year Reich watch their nation divided among foreign powers. The cognitive gap between expectation and reality proves too large for many minds to bridge. Women who had been praised as mothers of the master race now face the horror of Soviet occupation and mass rape. Children who had been raised to worship the Führer must suddenly learn that their hero was a monster. Veterans who had fought believing in German destiny return home to find their sacrifices rendered meaningless by total defeat. The entire foundation of meaning and identity crumbles simultaneously. Allied forces deliberately confront Germans with evidence of Nazi atrocities, marching civilians through liberated concentration camps and forcing them to witness the results of their complicity. The scenes that unfold reveal the complex psychology of a people awakening from systematic delusion. At Bergen-Belsen, British forces compel local German civilians to walk through the camp, past piles of corpses and starving survivors. Many Germans vomit or faint at the sight. Others weep uncontrollably. But their responses vary dramatically, revealing the different ways human minds cope with overwhelming moral horror. Some Germans express genuine shock and claim complete ignorance of the camp's existence. "We didn't know" becomes a common refrain, and for some, this ignorance may be genuine. The regime's compartmentalization of information meant that many Germans knew Jews were being relocated without understanding the true nature of that relocation. But for others, ignorance was willful, a psychological defense against uncomfortable truths that threatened their self-image and worldview. Dr. Maria Hoffmann, a nurse from near Dachau, writes in her diary, "I told myself the stories about the camps were enemy propaganda. I didn't want to believe that we could do such things. Now I see the truth with my own eyes, and I understand that my ignorance was a choice." I chose not to see what was happening because seeing would have made me complicit. Other Germans react with defensive anger, claiming the evidence is fabricated or exaggerated. This response represents a desperate attempt to preserve their psychological investment in Nazi ideology by rejecting contrary evidence, no matter how overwhelming. Some insist that if atrocities occurred, they were the work of a few extremists who betrayed true Nazi ideals. This rationalization allows them to maintain their belief system while distancing themselves from its most horrific consequences. The most psychologically revealing responses come from Germans who admit knowledge but claim powerlessness. What could we have done? They ask. We were just ordinary people trying to survive. This response reveals how the regime's systematic intimidation and propaganda had created genuine psychological paralysis among the population. Many Germans had convinced themselves that resistance was impossible, and therefore they bore no moral responsibility for the regime's crimes. The psychological impact of defeat creates different responses among different segments of German society. These responses reveal both the depth of Nazi penetration into German consciousness and the various ways human minds adapt to the collapse of fundamental beliefs. The true believers. Some Germans remain convinced Nazis even after total defeat. They develop conspiracy theories explaining away Germany's loss, secret Jewish manipulation of the Allies, betrayal by German generals, or premature surrender that prevented secret weapons from achieving victory. These true believers often emigrate to South America or retreat into isolated communities where they can maintain their delusions without constant contradiction. Heinrich Müller, a former SS officer, writes from hiding in Argentina, "The war is not over. It was merely the first battle in the eternal struggle between Aryan civilization and Jewish world domination. Germany lost this battle through betrayal and overwhelming enemy numbers. But the cause remains just, and victory remains inevitable." The pragmatic adapters. A larger group of Germans quickly abandons Nazi ideology out of practical necessity rather than moral conviction. These pragmatists recognize that supporting Nazism is now dangerous and unprofitable, so they adopt democratic rhetoric while maintaining their fundamental authoritarian attitudes. They prove willing to work with Allied authorities and embrace Western values, but their conversion remains superficial. Wolfgang Schmidt, a former Nazi Party member who becomes a successful businessman in post-war West Germany, later admits, "I never really believed in democracy or human rights. I simply learned to say the right words and follow the new rules. The important thing was to rebuild Germany and restore our prosperity. The ideology was always secondary to practical success." The moral awakeners. Some Germans experience genuine moral awakening, confronting their participation in or tolerance of evil with horror and determination to build a better society. These individuals often become the most committed Democrats in post-war Germany, having learned through bitter experience the importance of protecting human rights and maintaining vigilance against authoritarianism. Anna Richter, a former German teacher, becomes active in democratic education reform. "I taught children to worship Hitler and hate Jews. I told them that obedience was the highest virtue, and that questioning authority was treasonous. Now I understand that I was destroying their capacity for moral reasoning. My life as work must be helping young people learn to think critically and make their own moral judgments." The traumatized victims. Many Germans retreat into victim narratives that allow them to avoid confronting their moral responsibility. They focus on their own suffering during Allied bombing, Soviet occupation, and post-war hardship while minimizing or ignoring the suffering they inflicted on others. This psychological defense mechanism helps preserve self-esteem but prevents genuine moral reckoning. Marguerite Weber, who lost her home in the bombing of Dresden, writes, "We were victims too. We suffered terrible hardships during the war and after. Why should we be held responsible for things we didn't personally do? We were just trying to survive like everyone else." The Allied attempt to purge Nazi influence from German society reveals both the complexity of mass brainwashing and the difficulty of reversing its effects. Denazification proves far more challenging than simply removing Nazi officials from power. It requires confronting the psychological transformation of an entire population. The process begins with a questionnaire designed to identify Nazi supporters and war criminals. Germans must answer detailed questions about their party membership, military service, and wartime activities. But these questionnaires reveal the inadequacy of formal criteria for measuring ideological commitment. Many Germans who never joined the Nazi Party supported the regime enthusiastically, while some party members had joined for career advancement without believing Nazi ideology. The screening process also encounters the problem of German self-deception and deliberate misrepresentation. Former Nazis quickly learned to portray themselves as victims or passive observers who were forced to conform against their will. They claimed to have secretly opposed the regime while publicly supporting it, or to have joined Nazi organizations without understanding their true nature. Klaus Weber, a former Nazi propaganda official, tells his denazification tribunal, "I was never a true believer. I joined the party because it was necessary for my career, and I tried to moderate the worst excess from within. In my heart, I always remained a Democrat who opposed Nazi extremism." Such claims prove almost impossible to verify, and Allied authorities find themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of Germans seeking to reinvent their wartime histories. The process becomes less about identifying genuine Nazis and more about determining who could be trusted to function in a democratic society. More fundamentally, denazification struggles with the question of collective versus individual responsibility. Nazi Germany required the participation or acquiescence of millions of ordinary people who were neither war criminals nor ideological fanatics. How should democratic societies treat factory workers who built weapons, teachers who indoctrinated children, or bureaucrats who processed deportation orders? The answers reveal deep philosophical tensions about moral responsibility and collective guilt. The collapse of Nazi Germany creates profound generational divisions that persist for decades. Different age cohorts experience the regime differently and respond to its collapse in dramatically different ways, creating lasting tensions within German families and society. The war generation. Germans who fought in World War II face unique psychological challenges. Many genuinely believed they were defending their homeland against foreign aggression, and their military service provided meaning and identity that defeat renders meaningless. Veterans struggle with the knowledge that their sacrifices served an evil cause and that their courage was exploited by war criminals. Franz Müller, a Wehrmacht veteran, describes his psychological crisis. "I believed I was a soldier defending Germany. I fought bravely and lost many friends. Now I'm told we were the aggressors, that we were fighting for a regime that committed genocide. How do I reconcile my honor as a soldier with the dishonor of the cause I served?" Some veterans retreat into the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the claim that regular German forces fought honorably while atrocities were committed by SS units and political extremists. This myth allows them to maintain pride in their military service while distancing themselves from Nazi crimes. But it also prevents honest reckoning with their participation in aggressive war. The Hitler Youth Generation. Young Germans who experienced the regime's collapse during their formative years often reject Nazi ideology completely, but they also struggle with identity confusion and psychological trauma. They had been raised to worship Hitler and believe in German superiority, and these beliefs formed the foundation of their developing personalities. Ingrid Hartmann, who was 15 when the war ended, later reflects, "Everything I had been taught about right and wrong was suddenly reversed. The adults who had told me to hate Jews and love the Führer now told me those same beliefs were evil. I didn't know what to believe or who to trust. It took years to develop my own moral compass." This generation often becomes the most critical of their parents, and the most committed to democratic values, but they also bear psychological scars from their manipulation and the collapse of their worldview during adolescence. The children of perpetrators. Perhaps most tragically affected are German children who discover that their parents participated in Nazi atrocities. These children must reconcile their love for their families with horror at their crimes, creating psychological conflicts that persist throughout their lives. Peter Hoffman learns after the war that his father was a concentration camp guard. How do you love a father who murdered innocent people? How do you honor a man who betrayed everything decent in humanity? I spent my entire adult life trying to understand how the gentleman who read me bedtime stories could have participated in genocide. German women face unique challenges in confronting the Nazi legacy because their role in the regime was both significant and systematically minimized by post-war narratives. Nazi ideology had glorified women as mothers of the master race while excluding them from formal political power, creating complex relationships between gender, complicity, and victimhood. Many German women had enthusiastically supported Nazi policies, particularly those targeting Jews and other minorities. They had participated in boycotts of Jewish businesses, reported suspicious neighbors to authorities, and raised their children to embrace racial hatred. Yet post-war society often portrayed women as passive victims who had no choice but to conform to male-dominated Nazi authority. This gendered narrative of victimhood allowed many women to avoid confronting their active participation in Nazi crimes while simultaneously denying their moral agency. Women who had made independent choices to support the regime could now claim they were simply following orders from husbands, fathers, and male leaders. Greta Schneider, who had been an enthusiastic Nazi supporter, tells Allied investigators, "Women had no power in Nazi Germany. We did what our husbands and the authorities told us to do. How could we have resisted when we had no political rights or economic independence?" Such claims contained elements of truth. Women did face legal and social restrictions under Nazi rule, but they also obscured the reality that many women had supported Nazi ideology because they believed in it, not because they were forced to conform against their will. The experiences of rape and sexual violence during the Soviet occupation create additional complexity in post-war narratives. German women who suffered these atrocities become symbols of German victimhood, but this symbolic status makes it even more difficult to discuss their potential complicity in Nazi crimes. Acknowledging women's agency in supporting Nazism seems to blame victims of sexual violence, while focusing only on their victimization erases their moral responsibility. The psychological reckoning with Nazi Germany intersects powerfully with economic reality as Germans confront the material consequences of their political choices. The regime's economic policies, which had seemed so successful during the 1930s, now reveal their unsustainable foundations built on debt, slave labor, and preparation for aggressive war. Germans who had benefited from Jewish property confiscation, forced labor, and territorial conquest now face demands for restitution and reparations. Families who had moved into homes seized from deported Jews must confront the source of their improved living conditions. Businesses that had profited from concentration camp labor must acknowledge their participation in crimes against humanity. This economic reckoning forces Germans to confront their material complicity in Nazi crimes. It becomes impossible to claim ignorance or passive victimhood when the evidence of participation exists in their bank accounts, their homes, and their business records. The prosperity they had attributed to Nazi genius now appears as the proceeds of theft and murder. The post-war economic collapse also demonstrates the regime's fundamental dishonesty about German capabilities and resources. The autarky and self-sufficiency that Nazi propaganda had celebrated proved to be illusions maintained through conquest and exploitation. Germany's actual economic weakness becomes apparent when stripped of its stolen resources and captive labor force. Yet this economic reckoning also creates new forms of self-deception and denial. Many Germans focus on their post-war poverty and hardship while avoiding discussion of how they had acquired their wartime wealth. They complain about Allied occupation policies while ignoring the far harsher treatment Germany had imposed on conquered territories. The German confrontation with Nazi crimes occurs within the broader context of Allied victory and the emerging Cold War, factors that significantly influence both the process and the outcomes of denazification efforts. The international political situation creates both opportunities and limitations for genuine moral reckoning. The Nuremberg trials represent a revolutionary moment in international law, establishing the principle that individuals can be held accountable for crimes against humanity, regardless of their official position or claims to be following orders. These proceedings create legal frameworks for preventing future genocides while documenting the methods and consequences of Nazi manipulation. Yet the trials also face limitations in addressing the broader question of German collective responsibility. Focus on prosecuting major war criminals allows many Germans to externalize blame onto Nazi leadership while avoiding confrontation with their own complicity. The legal emphasis on individual responsibility makes it easier to ignore the systematic nature of Nazi crimes and the widespread participation they required. The emerging Cold War further complicates denazification efforts as both East and West seek German allies against their former partners. In West Germany, the need to build an anti-communist bulwark leads to the rehabilitation of former Nazis who can serve Western interests. In East Germany, the communist government claims to have eliminated fascism through socialist revolution while often simply replacing Nazi officials with communist ones. These geopolitical pressures mean that thorough denazification gives way to pragmatic accommodation much sooner than genuine moral reckoning would require. Former Nazis return to positions of influence in both German states, and discussion of war crimes becomes subordinated to contemporary political needs. The incomplete reckoning with Nazi crimes creates lasting psychological and cultural consequences that persist for generations. The failure to fully confront the reality of mass participation in genocide leaves unresolved trauma that affects German society long after the immediate post-war period. The concept of communicative silence emerges in German families and society, a tacit agreement not to discuss wartime experiences and choices that might prove uncomfortable or incriminating. This silence prevents the transmission of historical knowledge between generations while allowing myths and self-deceptions to persist unchallenged. Children and grandchildren of Nazi perpetrators grow up sensing secrets and lies in their family histories without understanding their nature. This creates what psychologists term inherited trauma, psychological disturbance passed down through generations, even when the original experiences remain hidden or denied. Only in the 1960s, the younger Germans begin seriously questioning their parents' generation about their wartime experiences. This delayed reckoning reflects both the psychological difficulty of confronting systematic manipulation and the social pressures that discouraged honest discussion of Nazi crimes. The student movements of 1968 represent a partial breakthrough in this wall of silence, as young Germans demand honest accounting of their nation's past. But even these movements often focus more on abstract political analysis than on personal family histories, maintaining emotional distance from the human reality of Nazi crimes.